The information shared on this podcast is based on our comprehensive research and understanding. All suspects are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey y'all, welcome back to A Natural State of Murder Crimecast, sponsored by Revamp. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube and like us wherever you get your podcasts. In our last episode, we talked about Alvin Lee Myers and some of his history. Now, in this episode, we will dive into his manifesto. So, Patty, I understand that Revamp did a search of Alvin's home. And this is where we found this manifesto.
Correct.
Tell me a little more about that.
So we'd heard for quite some time from different people and different agencies about the manifesto, which he titled his life from 1945 to 1988, I believe. But we had heard about it. So when we searched the house after he passed away in May of 2020, we were given the keys to the house and we searched and we did find the manifesto. The manifesto, I think we're going to share with the audience, is his life story. And it was something that he valued. He thought that eventually they were going to make a movie out of his life. He thought he was going to be famous. He thought that he was going to be the next well-known psychic, the person with premonitions, ESP, things that came true. And I think I told you, he had hundreds and hundreds of lottery tickets where he thought that he was going to win the lottery also. So I think that says a lot for him. He never won it, of course. But the manifesto, it took us about a week to transcribe it. It was very hard to read. He wrote very small. He never skipped a line. He a lot of times didn't use spaces. So it was really, really hard to read. We also have the handwritten manifesto as well as the transcribed one.
Mm-hmm. And I know that on our website that we are going to provide a copy of his handwritten manifesto and then the typed manifesto that Revamp worked so hard to get. But the manifesto itself, it starts out, and I have read it. He starts out talking about these psychic experiences that he has had since the age of 7.
Yes.
And he mentions dreams, warnings, out of body experiences. He even mentions like a demon or an even evil spirit named deja vu, is what he calls it. To me, it sounds like deja vu. What are your thoughts?
So from an early age, we interviewed a lady that lived next door to him. From an early age, he pretty much had to fend for himself. Um, I I can't imagine raising a child in the environment that he was raised in, and subjecting things that a child to the things that he says he was subjected to, or that she says he was subjected to as a child. I don't know how much of this is truth, but I do believe that everything he wrote, he believed to be the truth. Um, from the time he was very small, he lived in the same area as his hero, who was Herman Edward Lamb and Pretty Boy Floyd. And Pretty Boy Floyd had passed away, and he was fascinated with Pretty Boy Floyd. So I think even from an early age, the very first time that he had any interaction that he has written about or that we're familiar with, he had an interaction with the brother of Pretty Boy Floyd, who was the sheriff at the time, who came and told him that his father had been killed. And that's pretty much the first time that he brings up Pretty Boy Floyd or the Floyd family, or that he believes he's reincarnated. So, and I think he was about 7 when he found out his father was killed. Um, and like I said, E.W. Floyd came to his house and told him that his father had been killed by law enforcement out in Oklahoma. And I think it just took off from there, or it seems to.
And yeah. And so Jeremy, like I know that he mentions, like he kind of goes into like a partial list of his criminal activity.
Mhm.
Um, but Alvin talks about this evil spirit that caused him to do bad things. Like, is to me that is someone that's blaming somebody else for
Sort of
their.
predicting. Yeah. So with Alvin, when you read this manifesto, you're reading it and you're going, this is either a really bad guy or it's somebody that is writing a crime story. The problem is when you go to researching some of these crimes, he apparently did quite a few of them. I don't think we've been able to develop that he was involved or did all of them, but there's been enough research to show that he did several. So if you're going down that road and you say, well, he did 7 out of 10, I don't know that he did do 10 out of 10. It's just that they go so far back and they're so isolated incidents that we have to find the records on some of these things is pretty tough. Alvin was, I think, writing this to more or less sum up what he thought were his accomplishments. Um, these were traumatic moments in his life, whether he knew it or not, and the trauma from these incidents, whether he considered it good or bad, it lived in his life. Now, I've said many times that we're going to get this forensically analyzed. We're also going to post it on our website, remembereveryvictim.com, and there may be a multitude of different thoughts or people that come forward and say, "Yeah, I remember that," and that's what we're hoping for. We're hoping that when we post it, that people are going to come forward and say, "Yeah, this is when this happened. This was my uncle so and so, or this was my aunt so and so. He did this too," and maybe we'd be able to get some victims some solace because of that. Um, we're not posting it immediately because we want to kind of get the story out there behind Alvin. Alvin, like I told you last episode, I think he was the epitome of evil, and
Mm-hmm.
I think anybody brags about the things they did that hurt others, they find joy in torture. There's issues there that are not solvable. But this manifesto is a really good outline of the things that he remembers that he did that brought trauma and detriment to others. So,
Yeah.
from a law enforcement perspective, this is what we would call a clue, a massive clue. This clue
Yeah.
is the type you want to take to court with you. If I had him
Yeah.
in custody in an interrogation room, I would be reading this piece by piece, and we'd be in there for hours going over. Okay, well, tell me about this that you did, and this that you did, and
Mm-hmm.
this that you did. So,
Yeah.
Well,
And you're
he
absolutely
had a
correct. There's so much and there's so many layers.
So the thing is, with his childhood, he had a really odd childhood compared to what I consider a normal childhood. He, at an early age, says that in this manifesto, now whether it's true or not, but he says in this manifesto that his mother asked him to shoot somebody, not once, but twice. He also had a traumatic accident and he was in the hospital. And I think that he believes that that had some bearing on his psychic powers. He went to prison, a really harsh prison, by the time he was 17 years old. He went to McAllister. And he was only 17. I still consider that a child, really. Um,
And it
he-
is. It is.
yeah,
I mean, you're still legally a child.
yeah, yeah. And he went to one of the hardest prisons in Oklahoma, probably in Oklahoma and Arkansas, in McAllister. And he writes about being in McAllister. I think that he spent several years there, and when he got out, he went right back to his old way. But he was sent to McAllister because he stole a city pickup, or was accused of stealing a city pickup in Sallisaw. He was convicted of it. There was also an armed robbery in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And then he and two other men went to Eufaula and broke into a lady's house. From that house, they stayed there all night. He says that she had sex with all of them. The police reports say that he and the other two raped the woman and tormented the children all night. and then he went to Texas, and they got this bright idea that they would just cover the
Well,
tag
hold on,
number.
Patty.
Yes.
So that's what I'm talking about with this guy. Is so his story is he goes there and they had sex with a woman all night.
Hmm.
Obviously, he was convicted of raping her and along with
Yes.
the others all night.
Yes.
So
Yes.
when the children home when this happened,
Yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
Two little
and
children.
and so what constituted the rape in this particular case? Did he use the children to as more or less a tool to make her have willing sex? Is what he would call it. And is it one
He's
of those
really
things
not
where
clear, and neither are the court records. But I mean, he definitely was charged with the rape. He and the two other guys were charged with the rape. To hear her version, what little records there are still left of it, is that they broke into her house. Her husband worked out of town at the time, and they tormented her children all night. Now, she doesn't go into detail, neither do the court records, on what the torment of the children were. They don't know what it was. But in the court records, it said they raped her, and in his manifesto, uh, he said they had sex all night, or she had sex with them. He makes it sound like it was willing. I think
yeah.
his being in touch with reality is a little bit different than everybody else's.
Yeah.
I don't think his reality was the same as everybody else's, or he just wanted to paint it that he wasn't a bad guy. The woman just had sex with him. I'm not sure which it was. So he
Could
goes
it
off.
be could it be that, or could it be that he just thinks so highly of himself that there is no woman that would not want to have sex with me?
I think that's probably a lot of it. I think he probably thought more of himself or placed himself, because he does embellish some to some degree. Now, how much we don't know, but he talks about how he ran everything in prison, and that's
Yes,
probably not the case. You
probably
know,
not. I mean, just like looking at pictures of him, I cannot imagine him being the type of man or person, whatever, that ran things in prison. And that is the way that he makes it look like.
yeah. So
Delusions
he
of grandeur.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he also writes about assaulting some inmates and gave them major head trauma.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if that happened or not. We have no proof of that. He talks about running a scheme in prison to make money, and that he made a lot of money. There's no evidence of that he made any money. In fact, his mother supported him while he was in prison.
Did he say he
So
was sentenced for like 90 years?
he claims that. I don't think it was quite 90 years, but he was 17. He got out, I think, in 74. So he goes to prison. He gets out in 74. While he's in prison, he gets a welding certificate.
In
And
1974, he was 74.
in 1974, he gets out of prison
Okay.
in 1974.
Yep.
Now, he
Okay.
broke out of prison once while he was there, and they stole a car, and he talks about that. He talks about they stole a car, and it broke down in Eufaula or somewhere around Eufaula on their way
Hmm.
back. And they tell a tow truck driver, hey, we have this car. It's not running. If you'll give us a ride back to Sallisaw, we'll give you the title to this car. So he gives them a ride back. And when they get to Sallisaw, the mother says, oh, she jumps right in and says, I will send the title to you. And the record driver believes it. It was a stolen car to start with. She didn't have the title. So I think he probably learned from the best. And he could just come up with excuses or alibis right off. But I don't think he put a lot of weight in it, because I believe that he thought that he was protected, and he was lucky. He's named as the number one suspect in several homicides and was never charged. So he was at
Yeah,
some point lucky.
but he brings up this evil spirit, this
Hmm.
demon, whatever you want to call it, several
Hmm.
times,
Hmm.
um that makes him do these things. And I think that he honestly believes that. Where are we at mentally? I think
So
that he honestly, or where are we at mentally? Like, are we honestly seeing dead people? Like, do we honestly think that we see this entity that is, encouraging us to do wrong? Or are we using it as an excuse to do what we shouldn't?
So keep this in mind. According to a lady who lived next door to him when he was about 5 years old, he and his sister were left to fend for themselves. So, can you imagine at the age of having a 5 year old and a younger child and going off and leaving them all day and night, sometimes for a couple of days, for them to fend for themselves, food, shelter, whatever? And I can't imagine how scared a 5 year old would normally be. Um, so I don't know how much of that he imagined for his protection. I don't know if it was a defense that he used. I don't know for a fact, one way or the other, whether he used his mother, that his mother had him shoot, according to him, his mother had him shoot two people when he was a young child. He also talks about her having a bar and that she would take customers that had a lot of money and send them out the back door, and he was sent out to roll them. And so I don't know how much of it is transferred, that he wanted to believe there was a bad person rather than his mother, because I understand him and his mother were very close up until just a few weeks before they passed away. They were, and from the time he got out of prison, they were never far from each other. He usually lived with her most of the time.
So
But
Jess, let me say this. You talking about him having these missions and evil spirits, right? The reality is we talk about drugs and we talk about people having mental disorders having similarities, right? Someone that's on drugs maybe has similar recollections as someone that's got mental problems. Well, okay, so I teach some stuff with different types of drugs and how they affect the body, and there's one drug category that we call dissociative anesthetics. With dissociative anesthetics, one of the things that I've interviewed multiple people that have been impaired on those types of drugs, they will talk about PCP being one of the main drugs. They'll talk about how it's like having outer body experience. And the best version I've ever heard anybody tell me of all time was, imagine your body is a remote control robot. Okay? And you can see the robot. You can control what the robot does. You have the remote control. But anything and everything it does, you can't feel that. So when we talk about dissociative anesthetics, we're talking about anesthesia. So think when you go have surgery, right? You have anesthesia and they can cut your leg off and you don't feel it, right? That's anesthesia. It completely dissociates your feelings from your brain. So that's what dissociative anesthetics do, like PCP, ketamine, things like that. Robo tripping. You ever heard the term robo tripping? Those are the type of drugs that do that. So imagine you can control what your body does, but you can feel anything that occurs. So as you're walking, you're walking, you're touching the floor, you just can't feel the floor. As you go and cut your wrist or cut your hand off, you know what's happening, you're doing it, but you can't feel it. That is what we relate when we talk about like a sociopath or like someone that has mental disorder, where they're so evil and so violent they can do things. They know it's wrong, they're doing it, and they see themselves doing it, but they still don't feel anything from it. It's
I
like you
know,
and I.
but this is somebody that honestly, and the jury is still out for me, that this was somebody that felt that he was honestly like Pretty Boy Floyd
Mm-hmm.
reincarnated.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, he's the controller.
yeah,
He's the
and
guy controlling.
let's look at his life versus Pretty Boy Floyd.
Okay.
And and he mentions it. He mentions it in the manifesto. Pretty Boy Floyd. Um, I don't believe that he was as evil as Alvin was, and I just don't. But at the same time, um, Alvin thought that he was a badass or whatever.
Yeah.
And Alvin mentions in his manifesto that he went to try to rob a bank, which was, Pretty Boy Floyd's Charles Arthur Floyd.
Uh-huh.
That was his thing. That
Mhm.
he tried to do that twice, and both times he was caught before that happened.
Mhm.
And it was almost like it was a failure on his part.
Yeah, because he was very fixated on Pretty Boy Floyd. He actually,
Very.
I've been told that he slept on the graveside of Pretty Boy Floyd. He grew up in the same area as
Twice.
yeah, well, more than twice actually. I think that when he was a child, that's where he would go. He didn't live very far from where Pretty Boy Floyd was buried up on Brushy Mountain. But even in his adult life, I interviewed his first wife, and she said that he would just disappear. She said he would get in this trance and he would just be staring at the ceiling for hours, and then he would just take off. And she thought that he either went to the cemetery. Sometimes he would take his metal detector and go in northern Sequoia County. And she said he'd be gone for a day or two. But she said he would just kind of zone out. He had this thing about marrying girls that were really young. I mean, even when he was in his 30s, the first time that he married a girl that was 16. His
Mm.
second wife was 16 a few years later. But he believed that I do believe that he thought he was Pretty Boy Floyd reincarnated, and Pretty Boy Floyd had quite a following in Sequoia, or in the whole area, really, in the Northwest Arkansas, Western Arkansas, and Eastern Oklahoma. But he was known as a bad guy. He was a robber, but everybody liked him. And I don't know that that was the case with Alvin. Pretty Boy Floyd would do a lot for the community. I don't know that Alvin did that.
Yeah.
At one point, we were told that Alvin even tried to dig the grave up of Pretty Boy Floyd, but he was unsuccessful.
Yeah, and that's what I have kind of seen as far as Pretty Boy. He was kind of almost like a Robin Hood.
He
Yeah, he
was.
did bad things, but he turned around
Hmm.
and he gave to the poor. He
Hmm.
gave, you know, and I think that he even had some members of his family that were like within law enforcement
Hmm.
that tried to protect him.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Well, his brother
Well,
was
wasn't
sheriff.
his brother the sheriff?
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Hmm.
And his brother the sheriff was the one that had arrested Alvin and
Yes.
told Alvin about his father.
Yes.
Yeah, it
So
was EW. Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
And and
so
Alvin, Jeremy, that's a good point. I feel like if you read through this manifesto, like from beginning, middle to end, as far as law enforcement or anybody else goes, within power, I feel like EW is, and that's the brother that Alvin
E.W.
has
Floyd.
like this, yeah, EW Floyd. Alvin has this very special connection with him. Like
He even writes about that. If you'll remember in the manifesto, he talks about E.W. Floyd as the one that drove him after the trial to
Mhm.
prison. And he said, I wanted to tell him that I was his brother, but I didn't.
Yes, and I saw that, but how much of that is he is concerned about what EW Floyd is going to feel about him?
I don't know. I don't know.
Uh,
But he
There
talks
there are
about
so
E.W.
many
Floyd.
layers.
Hmm. Yeah. So he believes that he was chosen by God. He believes that he is put on this
Yes.
earth with these special powers, and he believes that he has memories of being in his mother's womb.
Sucking
He
his thumb. Yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh. He has memories of standing in line when they were boarding the
Mhm.
ark, that's mentioned in the Bible. Um, he was at that time he was given that gift of being a psychic. He believes when he was 7, he had a premonition that someone in the home, um, that he was home alone, and he claims that somebody broke in. He also claims that he had this dream about buried treasure under this neighbor's house, and he tried to get them to dig it up. They wouldn't do it. The house sold, and he said that he claims that later on they did find something buried under the front porch of the house when it was
Mhm.
torn down. I have not been able to confirm that, but I did ask his mother-in-law, his first mother-in-law, who also knew him when he was a small child. She knew him as he grew up. She said that yes, she does remember that too. Um, so, there's just a lot of things, but, he lived in rural Oklahoma and it was a different world than it is now. But another thing is, his mother had him when she was really young. And even though the death certificate says he was born in Sequoia County, he wasn't. He was born in California. She went to California with his father, the one that was killed later on when he was just a child. And everybody told him that he was a lot like his father. I don't have that much history on his father. I know that his father is buried somewhere around Hugo, Oklahoma. That's really all I know about him. But he was his mom's shadow, and they had a very, what I would call an unnatural relationship.
Mhm.
Um, she was a hard worker, don't get me wrong. She was a hard worker, but she also uh, took over two houses by people that suddenly died. There are the stories that she had her son rolling drunk men as they went out of her bar. She had a bar down in Fort Smith, downtown Fort Smith. Um, there's just a lot of stories. Some of them we can prove, some of them we can't. Um, the dream about the house fire that was over the buried treasure, I wish we could confirm that. I don't. I know there were several house fires involved around in his community when he was small. Let's
Yeah,
just say
well,
that.
there was just several involved with him, period, right?
Exactly. Yes. And it
Yeah.
continued on. A man that lived next door to him and his mother, he signed over a guardianship or a will and named his mother as the beneficiary of everything. And he suddenly died. And then he had five dogs, and they suddenly died within a week of his death. She inherited the house and his belongings. There was a story about a lady that lived in Arcoma that listed Betty as his mother, as the sole beneficiary of the will. And she died from heat exhaustion in the middle of the night because they said she had kicked her fan over. And she left her home, her bank accounts, her cars, all her possessions to Alvin's mother. So, I don't know if it's one of those things that Alvin saw that was beneficial when, people passed away, you could inherit their homes,
Well, it's
or
learned behavior. It's
yeah,
learned
learning
behavior.
behavior.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's what it is. If you're raised, and that's how you are taught, and you're taught that the difference in right and wrong for certain people, their lives are different, right?
Uh-huh.
So
Mhm.
for him, the difference in right and wrong was, well, it might as well go to me, or if it's just going to go to the state or one of their family, it might as
Mhm.
well just go to me, because there's no line there of what's okay to do. And the truth is that's where we end or where we begin with the story is, he's shows up at a house fire in Fort Smith and says, "Hey, by the way, this guy over here, he signed his title over to me if he's dead. Is he dead? Oh, okay, he's dead. Okay. Well,
Hmm.
he signed a quick claim deed over to me, and yeah, there may be a person buried in that yard. Y'all mind getting that body out of here before I take over this house?" I mean, that's legitimately, he lived his whole life thinking that was cool, and he was
Mhm.
so good at it that he
Mhm.
was able to pacify the law enforcement, right?
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
that's who he is. That's the life he lived. That's his learned behavior. And
So what I also find interesting, Jeremy, is that he was named as the number one suspect in several homicides. Okay. And one of the prosecutors and one of the investigators in Oklahoma said that they really couldn't prove or disprove the premonitions. Okay. So when a body or a woman goes missing, if they didn't find her fast enough, he would start calling the police, and he would say, I had this dream, and I dreamed. Example, one of the women, and he doesn't really talk about this in his manifesto, but one of the women who he'd had a relationship with, they had lived together in Arcoma. She was from Salisaw. They broke up, and he goes to her house looking for her, and the mother says she went downtown Sallisaw, and he admits he was the last person. He picked her up. They had a long talk. They went for a drive, but he said he took her back and dropped her off in the parking lot. Now she goes missing. The family reports her missing, and within a day or two, he starts having premonitions about where she is. That she was being chased down the road by a white car with two men in it, and her clothes are folded up neatly beside her in the grave, and she's in a shallow grave. This all turns out to be the truth. But according to the sheriff and according to the investigator over there, the prosecutor said that's not enough. You cannot prove or disprove a premonition. So I think, in my opinion, that he learned early on that people were scared of these premonitions
Yeah.
in court in a
When
great
was
lot
that though? Like what year was that though?
in the mid 80s.
Mid
Uh,
80s versus today, I feel like it's a little different.
yeah, it
Like I
probably is.
feel like today that would have been handled differently.
So two women within a couple of years goes missing, and one of them is last seen in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and she's found over across the state line in Sequoia County. And it was the same thing. He had premonitions about her death, and they didn't find her remains for a long time. When they did, it was just skeletal remains, kind of like the first woman. But I can track him back into 1979 when the prosecutor wrote a letter and said, we're going to go forward with first degree murder charges against him the next month. And in between December of 79, when the girl was killed, kidnapped and raped and killed, until January of the next year, which was about a month later, something serious happened. And it was just one of those things that just worked out for him. And then a few years later, we find a 38 pages that was written by someone that supposedly was went with him when he did the kidnapping murder. I think that it's just a combination of things. I think he was bold. I think that he wanted law enforcement. He didn't, if he did commit a murder, which he was never charged with murder, but he is the number one suspect in several murders.
Several.
And sometimes, every one of them, he was the last person seen with them. That's pretty unlucky. However, he was lucky that he was never charged with any of those homicides. And the closest he comes to is we find a writing in his house that he broke up with one of his girlfriends in the Tucker Bottoms, and one of them was found in what is known as the Tucker Bottoms. So I think there's something to that. We also found
Mhm.
a 1989 calendar in his house, and we can share that with the viewers too, where he talks about going to Biloxi, Mississippi. He also goes to McLean, Mississippi. He comes back through Texarkana, Arkansas, and into Fort Smith, and then into Tulsa. And I know that he is a suspect in a case in Wagner County on the way to Tulsa. It happened in 1979, September the 13th, 1979. The one that we believe that for sure we're almost positive that he committed was in July 19th of 1979. And it's really odd because his mother worked really close to where this girl was kidnapped, but her family lived on the same block as Alan and his mom. So he would have known. He would have known a lot about her.
Yep. And I
Uh,
know, like, from his manifesto, there are a lot of just little comments, like
mhm,
little.
mhm,
And I know that at some point he said, if you read my manifesto, you'll get all my answers. And you
mhm.
don't. I mean, as far as the manifesto that we have, you don't. But he makes just enough.
So what he
Just
did, the first one,
that,
well,
what
the
were
first
you
one,
doing then? And it makes you want to go back and you have to research. Like, you have to. And then he calls this like a God given gift. And
yes,
he quotes from the Bible. He mentions
yes,
Matthew 21:21,
mhm,
but there's no justification there from God Almighty. Matthew 21:21 talks about having the faith of a mustard seed. That has nothing to do with you and your gifts and you seeing dead people or you being able to tell the future or any of these things, Alvin. Like, it has nothing to do with that.
we did
And I
find
can
a lot of Bibles. We did find a lot of Bibles, and he believes that going to church with his mother just reaffirmed his gift from God, and he writes about that. He
yeah,
maybe. He talks about a lot of things, but he never does. But Linda, what I was going to tell you a while ago is that the first time that I heard about this manifesto was a young girl was kidnapped out of Alma. And this is he calls them. He says he has these powers. He thinks he can help them locate her. They pick him up and they buy him a hamburger. They take him out for the day. This is the first time that I was aware that he had taunted police with this. He told one of the detectives, he just kind of slapped him in the stomach with it and said, "If you were smart enough to ever read this, it tells my life story." Of course, he was not real helpful in that endeavor. But now that's the only case that we do not believe that he was directly involved in, that he injected himself upon and in the middle of, because there are other cases that were high profile that he never injected himself on. And but the ones that he did, other than the little girl, he was the last person seen with them. He was the number one suspect. Sometimes he was the only suspect. So that puzzles me why he injected himself into that kidnapping out of Alma, Arkansas. Other than Jerry, the occupant of the house, had kidnapped a child that was the same age as Morgan, same physical description, within a couple 3 weeks after the little girl's kidnapping in Alma. So, and he also mentions some pedophiles in his writings. He mentions some things, but he never tells you the whole story, or you don't really know what to believe. So, I do think that there are hints in this manifesto, and so does law enforcement thinks that there are hints in it. But as far as being able to just say, here's where he confesses to one, he doesn't come right out and clearly say that.
Well, he does, but they're so old,
Yes.
and most of them he was already arrested for or involved with or whatever. So, but he, it's braggadocious. It's
Mhm.
braggadocious.
It is.
It's always that delusions of grandeur that I'm so good, y'all can't quite catch me. You can't see me. That whole thing. And the thing about Alvin in his manifesto, when you read over this, you can read it and say, well, this is completely fiction. There's nothing real here. And originally I did until we started researching and realized, no, these a lot of these things happen.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
it's not all fiction. So you have to really go in there and dive in and figure out how much of it's BS and how much of it's real cases, things that happen.
Exactly. And you have to
I,
read through it like how
it's
much of
it's
this is real, how
playing
much
games.
of, well, and and that kind of leads into our next episode is, it kind of leads into our next episode that, my question was, he wrote this. Did he intend for anyone else other than himself to read this, or did he want the world to read this when he was gone? Well, there's a point in that manifesto, and it's when he was in prison. When he was in prison, he mentions that he was able to control people with their mind.
Mhm.
He mentions that he was able to like make them move. He was able to do this. He was able to do that. And that there were other prisoners that were excited with that. But there was this guard. He mentions this prison guard that was very impressed with him. And he was like, I would love to write a book about you.
Mm.
And a little bit later in the manifesto, he mentions that he reached out to the guard, and after he's out of prison, obviously, and the guard is still very interested in writing that book about Alvin and his abilities.
So
And
I approached Alvin just, maybe a few weeks before his death. And I told him that we were wanting to do a documentary on him. And our team coordinator, Tom, had been checking on him because we lost him for a little bit. We couldn't locate him, and that was really strange. but he would walk his cats. He'd walk them on a leash. But
Mhm.
the only way that the way that I approached him is that we wanted to do a documentary. And of course, he was very intoxicated that day. And so I did not spend a lot of time with him. But he told people around him that one of these days he would be famous. And now, did he intend for that to happen before or after his death? I think if somebody would have enticed him at the right time before his death, he got to the point that I really believe that he probably would have turned that over. But even though he taunted law enforcement with it, he never gave that to anybody. And that, that tells me a lot. I mean, he kept it in his house. We found it, hidden in his house. So did he want to be famous before? No. But if he believed he was Pretty Boy Floyd reincarnated, he may believe that he's going to come back as somebody else in this life,
Yeah.
and be
But
famous.
I think that he believed in his abilities, and
Hmm.
I think that he believed that in the beginning, I think that he believed that he was Pretty Boy Floyd
Hmm.
incarnated.
I think he always
But
believed
when
that.
he tried to do pretty boy things, he failed
No,
miserably.
according to him, he didn't fail. God had other plans. God had other
Well,
plans.
I think we're
he
gonna get into specifics of his crimes.
he
We're gonna have to
did
break down each one of the specifics of his crimes.
each
We've
of
talked
his
about
crimes. Yeah,
multiple different murders here, and homicides and rapes and things that have happened, and we're gonna have to break those down each individually and see. First of all, did it even happen? Second, if it did happen, what were the details to it, and do they match the manifesto?
and he
So
does. And the
yeah,
thing
so
is, like at this point, like we have only been through 4 pages, four
Mhm.
pages of what, of 17 or 18 of his manifesto.
mhm.
And it's at this point, like he mentions that prison guard. He mentions that
Mhm.
prison guard that he had previously mentioned the prison guard about, I would love to write a story about you. And then he reaches this point where he was like, I reached out to this prison guard again, and this prison guard is still interested. And I think I might write that all down for him one day. All right. So in 1988, at this point in his manifesto, he mentions that he has written all of this down. And we question, why is that? Now, he had mentioned the guard and the guard wanting to write his story. He has mentioned that he reached out to the guard and the guard is still interested in writing the story. It's also at this point in the manifesto that the tone seems to change. And at this point, he starts to discuss his crimes specifically. And in the next episodes, we will cover the specifics of those crimes. So thank you all for listening. And do not forget to subscribe to our website at remembereveryvictim.com and hit the like and subscribe button on YouTube. And do not forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, goodbye, everybody.
Revamp is committed to forging a robust network of clear communication and understanding among the victim, the victim's family, law enforcement, and all parties involved in an unresolved case. Our mission is to provide a thorough service that uncovers resources, delivers vital information to support all parties, and rekindles public interest in these cases.